Mindfulness of breathing. You may have heard of it. It's one of the bedrock kind of meditation practices we have in Buddhism. And what I want to do today is discuss a bit of that importance and why it is something that we should get to know better. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So recently, Bhikkhu Analayo, who is one of the leading experts, scholars of early Buddhism, came out with a book called Mindfulness of Breathing, where he looks at the texts from early Buddhism on mindfulness of breathing, both within the Pali tradition, which is the sort of the one that is in a language closer to the one that the Buddha might have spoken, but also he compares it to the other recensions, the other examples, the other translations of these same texts that we find in Chinese and other languages. And what Analayo was really good about, he's one of the few people really working on this kind of comparative work to try to figure out what the earliest ideas might have been like. And so in this book is one that I highly recommend. I'll leave a link to it and the material that I discussed down below in the show notes in case you want to learn more. But in any event, one of the points that he makes over and over again in this book is how important this practice of mindfulness of breathing is in early Buddhism. Arguably, the bedrock kind of early Buddhist meditation practice is mindfulness of breathing. And what happens, I think, with many of us, it's sort of in human nature, I think, is that we tend to want something new and different, and tend to think that the new and different practices must be better, must be more advanced, must be deeper in some sense. But I think the material here is pushing back on that notion, is pushing back on this idea that the later meditation practices or the different meditation practices are somehow better or more powerful, more interesting for us than the more basic, if you like, the more early kind of meditation practices such as this one. The point here that Analayo makes in this book is that the Buddha himself in the early texts stresses the importance of this simple practice of mindfulness of breathing. Although we'll see that it's not quite as simple as it might seem, the point here is that mindfulness of breathing is said in the early texts to fulfill the four foundations of mindfulness as well as the 7 factors of awakening. That is, mindfulness of breathing, although it's often presented as a kind of an introductory practice, actually isn't introductory. And indeed, I have to admit that I myself tend at times in my videos to say, we start with mindfulness of breathing and then move into other things. Whereas what the Buddha is presenting here in these early texts is more this idea that mindfulness of breathing is, in a sense, encompassing of the whole path of meditative practice, or at least a large portion of it. Everything except perhaps the more advanced jhanic practices, which I won't be discussing really in this video in great detail. Now, I've done prior videos on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, as well as on these 7 factors of awakening. And I'll also leave links down below in the show notes if you want to know more about those. Essentially, they are descriptions of meditative practice and of the steps along that practice that lead us towards enlightenment, that lead us towards the final goal. Now, this approach may make practice seem relatively simple and straightforward, sort of reminiscent of the whole Zen kind of approach to meditation, where particularly in Soto Zen, it's said you just sit. So if you want an instruction on how to meditate, your teacher will tell you just sit. Sitting is everything, basically. Sitting is all you need to do, and that is sort of your only introduction to your practice, is just sit. And in a similar way, we might say, well, in the early Buddhism, the Buddha is telling us just follow the breath, just do breathing meditation. But in fact, the Buddha does actually give a 16-stage or 16-aspect kind of practice involved in breathing. So it's more complicated than just follow the breath, let's say. In an early sutta, the Buddha talks about going on a long retreat. The Buddha used to do this from time to time. He used to go on lengthy retreats by himself to go and meditate alone in the forest. And in one of these examples, the Buddha talks about going on such a retreat. Now, the exact length of this is somewhat in dispute, because in the Pali text it says 3 months, it's a 3-month retreat. In the Chinese example, it's a 2-month retreat. But in any event, this gives us an indication that this was a long period of time. This wasn't simply an afternoon or a day. And what the Buddha says about this retreat, this meditation retreat, is that during that retreat, he spent it practicing mindfulness of breathing, at least for the most part. Now, during this retreat, he said he did not want to be at all disturbed, so no one was supposed to come and talk to him. They were only supposed to come to him for absolute necessities, such as to bring him food and the like. And so this is, in other words, this is a period of time that the Buddha was practicing alone for several months, which shows that mindfulness of breathing is not a beginner's practice, because the Buddha himself was willing to, in fact, wanted to practice it for significant periods of time, even as he was a Buddha, even after he was enlightened, even after his own nirvana. Now, the question that arises, I think, for us is why? Why would he need to do this? And there are two separate questions that arise then. And one would be why anybody would need to do this, why somebody who was in training, somebody who was not enlightened, would need to do mindfulness of breathing, perhaps for long periods of time like this. And the second and related question is why the Buddha would need to do this. And these are questions that the Buddha actually answers in some of these early suttas. Now, for somebody who is still in training, for somebody who is still unawakened, as I take it all of us are still unawakened and unenlightened, the Buddha says that mindfulness of breathing is helpful because it leads us towards the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion. It leads us towards enlightenment. In the main text on mindfulness of breathing, which is the groundwork here, the Buddha discusses this whole aspect of how to practice this with his monastics, with a large group, it's said, of monastics who come from all over to hear what he has to say. And what's clear is that this group of monastics, first of all, it contains many very advanced monastics. They're not all beginners. And second, the Buddha says that these monastics, before he gives this speech about mindfulness of breathing, this talk, he says that the monastics are practicing particularly well, that they're very dedicated. This is not a group of laggards. This is not a group of people who are sort of slacking off. It's not it's not a group of advanced monastics who are perhaps not living up to their own potential. Instead, this is people who really know what they're doing. And it's in that context that the Buddha discusses mindfulness of breathing. And so this suggests to us that, at least the way this text happens to be formulated in the Pali, mindfulness of breathing is not a beginner's exercise. It's a relatively advanced exercise. I mean, in other words, we begin with it in a way, of course. We may, our first day of meditation, we may start with it. But that it's the sort of exercise that, taken in its fullness, is really quite advanced. It takes us a very long way, and that's indeed exactly the way the Buddha teaches it. He's basically saying, don't underestimate a practice of mindfulness of breathing. Don't expect or don't think that it's something that you only start with and then leave off. Indeed, one can read this text as the Buddha's essentially warning some of his more advanced practitioners not to underestimate this practice. Because it may be that indeed some of his advanced practitioners were sort of saying, well, okay, you beginners, you can start with this mindfulness of breathing and then we'll move on to something else. And the Buddha is saying, don't look at it that way. Mindfulness of breathing can be basically your entire practice. Now, the next question for us is why an enlightened person, such as the Buddha himself, would need to practice mindfulness of breathing. And the Buddha also answers this question. He says that he practices, or he went on this long, several-month retreat, and he says that he practices mindfulness of breathing because it leads to blissful meditation in the present life, and to mindfulness and awareness. Now, there are a couple of different aspects here. The first is that it's a blissful way of being. It's a happy, it's a pleasant state. And indeed, in many places in the suttas, the Buddha talks about how an enlightened person such as himself likes to spend time in these kinds of blissful or pleasant states, such as mindfulness of breathing, such as a jhanic state of deep absorption, various kind of meditative states that are simply pleasant to be in, and there's no reason not to pursue something pleasant if it's not harmful or not otherwise problematic, which these meditative states aren't. The second issue, however, is a little bit more, it raises more questions, should we say. The Buddha says that these states of mindfulness of breathing also lead to mindfulness and awareness. And it's a little bit questionable, or it might raise issues for us, as to why somebody who is already enlightened would need to foster states of mindfulness and awareness in themselves. I mean, after all, somebody enlightened is somebody who we would think is always going to be mindful, is always going to be aware in that sense. And so exactly what additional is being brought to them by pursuing a practice that leads them to a state that they're already in? Now, there are several different ways of approaching this question, but none of them is particularly satisfactory, I think. I mean, one of them might be that somebody who is awakened isn't always enlightened, that is to say, isn't always mindful or aware. And they're just degrees of mindfulness and awareness, and perhaps they're in a somewhat lower degree of mindfulness and awareness in their ordinary life, but when they practice mindfulness of breathing, that perhaps advances things a little bit for a time. It may also be that enlightenment, attaining nirvana, is not a perfected state in some way, but it's rather sort of an asymptotic closeness to perfection. And as they practice, even while being enlightened, so to speak, they're bringing themselves a little bit closer to that ideal. Now, neither of these options I've just raised are traditionally held. It's traditionally held that enlightenment is a perfected state, so we can't really get any better. But then it does raise the question of what exactly is this, why is the Buddha pursuing these practices even while he is enlightened? Sometimes people will say that the Buddha does these in order to set a good example for his students. That is to say, since he himself is practicing this way, his students have a good example in front of them of how to do the practice, but that's not really how he's presenting it here. He's presenting it as something good for him. That is, that it leads to mindfulness and awareness for him, which is why he's doing it. So these are large questions that I'm not going to be able to answer here, but at least there's things that we can think about, perhaps practice with, or set aside if they don't particularly interest us. The bigger question, perhaps, is, or the more important question for us, perhaps, is what are these 16 stages in this practice of mindfulness of breathing? And in my next lecture, I'm going to get into that. And I'll put a link up to that next lecture when it's out right up here, where we'll start that discussion. If you're getting something out of these videos, please take a look at my Patreon page and consider joining us. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. Be well.